before I start, let's review some of what the Princetonians of that time had experienced leading up to the resort era. To put together this presentation, I used, whoops, this jumped too many scenes ahead. Oh, maybe that's the problem. Okay, it jumped 2 slides ahead. I used 4 resources to put this together. A written summary by Harry Beaman, and that he did for the Princeton Historical Society in 1938. The 2 books done by Blake, The History of Princeton from 1915, and an article done by Phyllis Booth in 1994 on Princeton history. And lastly, a lot of images that we had in the historical archives. Here is Harry Beaman. Hopefully the next slide will come up. Nope, it did not. All right, so now here's the resources, the part that I wanted. And here's Harry Beaman. First, Harry Beaman was the son of Phineas and Alden Beaman and Harriet Thompson Beaman. He graduated from Harvard College in 1885 and married in Ohio in 1887 to Janine Hoover Bartlett, whose father was a native of Sterling, Mass. She passed away in June 1911, and he passed away in 1947. Harry Beaman served as president of the Princeton Historical Society in 1945 and 46. Some of the early Princeton milestones were, well, before I do that, the goal of this presentation is to document with images the impact of hotels and boarding houses on Princeton's rich history. In the late 1700s, Princeton was comprised of very small farming homesteads and a few taverns where people could stay overnight as they passed through town. This is what, according to Francis Blake's map from 1795, this is what Princeton looked like. Essentially, it had 2 major roads. One, does my cursor show when I move it across the screen?
Yeah, it's very small.
Okay, very small. Well, I'll have to work at trying to get that larger at another time. This east-west road and a sort of north-south road. The road east-west was called the Bay Path Trail, which followed Beaman Road in Princeton, in Sterling, to Houghton Road in Princeton, then to Miriam Road, then Thompson Road, to Old Colony Road, and into Hubston. The north-south road started in Worcester, went through Holden, following what is primarily Route 31 today, and we called it Worcester Road, up Mountain Road to Westminster Road. There was no Mountain Road all the way up to Mount Wachusett. There was, I went to Westminster Road and then over into Westminster. The first homestead in Princeton was awarded to Joshua Wilder in 1742. And it's on what is now Houghton Road. And we've marked it for people to find as part of a scavenger hunt. It was 120 acres, and he was, the grant that was given him was so that he could build a tavern there and farm the land for 5 years. And if he did so, the land would be his. His first child, which was a girl, was born in 1743. Whoops. This is the Amos Merriam map of what was called the Naquag properties or Naquag land. And it was divided into sections. This first section, which was the east wing, and one section was the east wing and division, which was set up in 1734. Then the Watertown and other farms which is in this area here, in 1736, and it included land which today is called Rutland and part of Hubston. Again, that was a map he drew in 1830, but went back to the early 1700s. The second tavern in town was the Elijah Moore Tavern, which was built in 1748 on what is now Merriam Road. This location is in the surrounding area, soon became Princeton's first town center, and eventually was called Russell's Corner. The home today is owned by the Carey family. Harry Beaman wrote at that time that, I have to slide my text forward, so if I pause, that's what I'm doing. Harry Beaman wrote, throughout the town for the next 80 years, we find more than 25 names of men keeping open houses for accommodations of travelers. But it wasn't until 1822, when Mr. Page managed the Wachusett House, that the word hotel was used to describe such locations. In 1759, Princeton became a district, and the first town meeting was held here at the Carey House or the Mort's Tavern. But that did not give Princeton representation in Boston. It only gave us representation through other towns. So we'd have to share or Princetonians would share their feelings about issues with other towns, and that was brought to Boston. In 1755, Lucy Keys disappeared off of Pine Hill Road. And this is Pine Hill Road here that goes sort of east to west or right to left, and the Keys property was here. In 1760, the population in Princeton was 265. So it was an extremely small town at that time. This is an artist's rendition of the first meeting house, which was built up on top of what is called Meeting House Hill or Mountain Road, where the Meeting House Cemetery is. In 1762, this area started to develop as a town center with a cemetery, a single-room schoolhouse nearby, but fell out of favor because it was so difficult for people to get to in inclement weather, and it was not, in my opinion, I imagine it also had something to do that it wasn't at the junction of major roads or roads through town. This is a map, a blown-up map of that 1830 map of Amos Merriam. There are 5 squares here in the which sort of highlight the places we've talked about. In the lower right-hand corner is the first homestead of Joshua Wilder. In the upper left-hand corner is where Lucy Keys' home was when she disappeared. The center, there's a square, a small square, and that shows where Moore's Tavern was and eventually Russell's Corner, which is right in that area. The center larger rectangle was smaller rectangle was where the meeting house cemetery and the first meeting house was, and then the larger square, a rectangle that shows where the eventual town center was, where Wachusett House was, the Gregory Store, the Congregation Church, and if you look further down, you can see where Broker Brooks's farm was and the tannery, and I'll mention those a little later. In 1763, at 136 today, at 136 Hubbardston Road, Princeton hired their first schoolmaster named Samuel Woods. He held classes and lived at this location for over 50 years. Redemption Rock as most of you might know, it became important because of something that happened at sunrise on February 10th in 1676 during the King Philip War. Lancaster was attacked by a group of various tribes of Indians. Marion Rawlinson and her 3 children were held captive for 11 weeks and traveled a great distance by foot in northern Massachusetts, and was ransomed back in May 2nd, 1776 at Redemption Rock, which is on Redemption Rock Trail or Route 140 heading toward Westminster. In 1768, the town built their first town pound, which is pictured here. It was described as needing to be built horse-high, pig-tight, and bull-strong. And you can see here in the distance, these stone walls to the left. They are the tombstones from Meeting House Cemetery. Other early mound stones were in 1767, the first minister, Timothy Fuller, was hired. The town was incorporated, where it gained its own representation in Boston in 1771. In 1775, Princeton formed its only first Minuteman Company. In 1787, the Shays Rebellion took place, which was led by Daniel Shays, not a Princeton resident, and was an armed uprising in mostly Western Massachusetts and Worcester in response to the debt crisis caused by England and the taxes that were being raised on the locals. The fight took place mostly in and around Springfield in 1786 and 87. Daniel Shays, led a troop of 4,000 rebels called Shayites during the Revolutionary War. In 1800, the population in Princeton was 1,021. In 1812, the first post office opened in the Russell store at 19 Miriam Road. Originally, this home had only 2 floors, with a 3rd floor mansard roof and a wraparound porches being added in the 1880s. Between 1819 and 1920, the Boylston Villa was built. The barn and farmhouse to the right were built on land where Governor Gill originally built his mansion. And this is where the resort town sort of begins as far as my research goes. In the early 1800s, a small group of scientists started using the old Indian trail they called the Coast Survey Trail to climb Mount Wachusett, to build a topographical survey and mapping station on the summit of Mount Wachusett. In 1840, the trail up Mount Wachusett was officially marked for others to use, and today it's known as the Mountain House Trail. Beaman wrote, "An interesting subject to consider is how the guests from all the soon-to-be-built hotels got to Princeton. I suppose in the early days, they came on horseback or rough carts over our very poor roads and trails. In 1822, the first once-a-week stage ran through Princeton from Royalston to Gardner to Westminster to Princeton to West Boylston to Worcester. In 1823, a second stage route began from Barry through Princeton to Boston. Carrying mail was its primary purpose. After 1849, there were additional stages during the summer months, both to Pratt's Junction in Sterling and to the Wachusett Railroad Station in Fitchburg. Harry can remember as a boy seeing the stage drive up in front of the Wachusett House, a Concord coach with 4 horses, with seats inside and on top, and a rack piled high with luggage on the rear. They could not very well dash up to the door in Wild West style, as they might like, as they had just finished climbing 7 miles of hills to get to their location. So this is a restored coach that is part of the Barre Historical Society, and it's very similar to what was used in Princeton. In 1830, the Princeton population was 1,346 people. This is a picture of the second Wachusett House from 1849 to 1869. It's 2 Worcester Road, and it's primarily in the location of where the current Dingman Park is. The house was built by Phineas Gleason, and it was built in the 1750s. And by early 1820s, it had been converted to allow for guests, and it was called the Wachusett House Hotel and managed by Mr. Page. Beaman wrote, in Princeton's Town History by Francis Blake, he tells of a big celebration in 1824 when an attempt was made to change the name from change the name of Mount Wachusett to Mount Adams in honor of John Quincy Adams, who had just been elected president. That meant changing the name of Wachusett House to the Mount Adams House, along with Mount Wachusett to Mount Adams. It is said that Ward Nicholas Boylston, who I showed a picture of the Boylston Villa earlier, entertained over 700 people at the hotel, which, according to Harry, strikes him kind of strange, seeing that this was such a small place, and could it really possibly have handled 700 people? A dance followed beginning at 4 p.m. They did not wait till midnight to start dances in those days. But soon after that, the Mount Adams was soon returned to Wachusett Mountain, and the hotel's name went back to the Wachusett House. In 1849, the 3rd stage was added to Princeton, from Princeton to Oakdale to Worcester. Beaman wrote then, or continued to write, in 1849, the original building, which was the one that preceded this one that's in the picture, the original building was moved and a new one was built, which is this one pictured. It was built by John Brooks, known as Broker Brooks, who lived at 25 Worcester Road at his farm called Hillside Farm, which I pointed out earlier in the map. His grandfather was the late Frank Goddard. Early on, the hotel was managed by his son, John Brooks, Jr., and then Harry's father, Phineas, managed it after that from 1859 to 1860, when they bought the home and began enlarging it to accommodate more guests. The thing I'd like you to notice here is a couple of things: that there's no trees around, very few trees, and that the barn's orientation is, I'll say, north-south, which you'll see later on changes. In 1850, Princeton's population was 1,254. As things began to, as Princeton began getting more popular, the Grimes Tavern opened at 48 Hubbardston Road. This was originally built in 1789 by Dr. Ephraim Wilson. Beaman writes, the Forest House had 5 rooms and opened in 1853 and was kept by Deacon Elwin Grimes, until 1919. So that was open for over 50 years. Deacon Grimes was an upright, respected citizen and served as town clerk for several years during the interim between the Gregory brothers, who served as town clerks. He took at least one ride on a double runner sled with his boys every winter as long as he was able. He operated the Forest House as a tavern boarding house, and it was eventually renamed the Grimes Tavern. In 1919, Mrs. Charlotte Crocker from Fitchburg bought the house. She summered at property she owned at Wachusett Meadows. She eventually gave that property to the Wachusett Meadows, and she was the godmother for Bishop James DeWolf Perry's daughter Beatrice. And after Beatrice died at a young age, she gave the property, the tavern, to the Perry family in 1923, and the property stayed in the Perry family as a residence until recently. Come on. In 1855, the Mountain House Hotel opened with 40 rooms. Beaman wrote, the Mountain House was initially the Micaiah Hobbs farmhouse, and Daniel Howe converted it into a hotel in 1855. So I imagine from this picture that the house ended before the addition to the left initially, and then Mr. Daniel Howe added the addition on. In 1859, he sold it to the Bullard brothers, and it became a very popular location for summer visitors for many years under their able management. As the only trail up Mount Wachusett began to the right of it, this brought much transient business and dinners for visitors and their horses. While there was always a friendly rivalry among other town hotels, after the arrival of the train station in Princeton in 1871, Mr. Bullard objected to having his mountain coach travel from the depot, the railroad station, to his hotel through Princeton Center. He claimed that some of his intended guests would get off and stay at the hotels in the center of Princeton as opposed to driving another few miles up the road or riding another few miles dusty road up to his hotel. Therefore, he was instrumental in having the road, which we call Allen Hill Road, reconfigured. Thus, by using this road, his coach passengers were no longer were tempted by the attractions of the center of town. The Bullards, who owned the Mountain House, also owned a farm at 115 Boyle Hill Road, where they grew fruits and vegetables and dairy products, which they sold to many of the hotels and rooming houses in town. In 1856, across the street, the Mountain Cottage was built at the top of Gregory Road, and it opened in 1860. Again, Beaman writes, after selling the Micaiah Hobbs home to Samuel and Moses Bullard, Daniel Howe bought the property across the street and built this Mountain Cottage on the easterly side of Mountain Road, opposite the Mountain House on Gregory Road. He died shortly thereafter, and his widow, who was the sister of Samuel and Moses Brown, continued to run the house for summer guests. After her death, her son William Howe continued to run the hotel. At this point, the expansion of various things in Princeton began. It just, I'll say quadrupled, but it just was ongoing all over town. The first was the Pratt's Cottage, which was located at 2 Radford Road and Hubbardston Road. Dr. Alfonso Brooks built this home, and he served as a doctor and for a short time postmaster in Princeton. His home was also served as a small shoe factory in the 1850s. Beaman wrote, but with Princeton becoming a summer resort destination and being on the main stage route from Barry to Princeton and the railroad station opening, this house turned into a boarding house run by William J. Morse, whose name you'll hear later on, with the distinction of being the only establishment in 1857 that was open to the public all year round.
Yeah.
In 1867, under the management of Mrs. Harriet Pratt and her daughter Lillian, the hotel was described as having a reputation for square dealings and good service. Pratt's cottage, sometimes called the Linden House, was favorably known for its comfortable accommodations and good home cooking. As it was open during the whole year, it was a resort for guests who wanted to stay in town after the closing of the other hotels, which usually was around October 1st. Princeton, the Princeton Historical Society is lucky enough to have a couple of the Pratt Cottage guest books.
Oh, really?
One thing that I wonder about in this picture is there's this large, on the left, there's this large home on the left of the picture. And I wonder what that was, and I have not yet been able to find out. This is a picture of the Baptist Church at 8 Mountain Road. Notice the columns in the barn behind it. Beaman wrote the Prospect House, later called the Princeton Inn, was originally a Baptist church located between what was the Ola House and the Gregory homes on Mountain Road. It was bought by Mr. Wilkes Roper and opened as of a 50-room hotel in 1860 and sold to Harry's uncle, I.F. Thompson, who ran the hotel for 14 years. After retirement, Thompson built the house right next to the old superintendent's home, which is now Mountainside Market on the right-hand side, which the Vickeries lived in at 227 Mountain Road. And it was the Goodnows lived there for many years. While Mr. Thompson was running the Prospect House, he had among his guests the Brunson family from Bristol, Rhode Island. The two boys, Edward and Clayton, being live wires, proceeded to make reputations for themselves as leaders in all kinds of harum-scarum, including stone throwing and breaking of church windows. Later, they developed into persistent hunters of woodchucks, and Mr. J.E. Merriam later presented Clayton with a beautifully penned Order of Merit for his help to farmers in destroying these pests. Now, Harry, Harry, you still there? No, he isn't, or he's off.
I'm here. I'm
Okay.
here.
Was J.E. Merriam the owner of your house?
Yes, J. Edwin Merriam lived in our house on Merriam Road.
Okay, so he was probably, his fields were probably some of the fields that Clayton was doing his woodchuck hunting. The other brother, Mr. Edward Brunson, later became an efficient worker for the Boys Club and Ball 9, which I assume is meant baseball, and especially for the Grange, for which he served as a master for many years. Summit House number 1. Harry Beaman writes, when I was a boy, William J. Morse, that's the same Morse that was involved with the Pratt Cottage or Linden House, in the middle of the 1860s, opened a small shelter, then a building partially made of stone at the top of Mount Wachusett summit, where he sold candy, cigars, and ginger ale. He used to take these supplies in a 2-wheeled cart drawn by a sober gray horse up over the rocky Mountain House Trail. Many kind-hearted ladies had much sympathy for the horse. Mr. Morse had a daughter named Nellie, who the boys in the area thought was easy to look at. In 1868, at 34 Goodnow Road, right before the train came through Princeton in 1871, Charles Whitaker enlarged his home and opened it as a summer boarding house, which he named the Mount Pleasant House.
Good.
Beaman writes, the Mount Pleasant House had one of the, I'll start over again. The Mount Pleasant House had, as one of its summer visitors, Helen Hunt Jackson, whose description of Princeton under the title The Hide and Seek Town appeared in Scribner's Magazine in August 1876. This article without illustrations is also found in our library in Bits of Travel at Home by Mrs. Jackson. Why we as the hotel people did not take more advantage of such great advertising material, I cannot quite see, except perhaps for the fact that all of our hotels were fully full of guests every summer at that time, and we did not need additional advertising. A note for me is that I will make that article available when we post this recording. The Howard House at 16 Worcester Road. From 1668 to 1689, Deacon Nelson Howard ran the Howard House, which was located at 16 Worcester Road and is no longer there. The good deacon was both a carpenter and a mason, and during the winters, he would put his time in enlarging this house until he had room for 40 guests. After he gave up taking in boarders, he rented some of the rooms for overflow guests if the center hotels needed extra rooms. These outsiders were the ones we called hauled mealers, as we used to send a carriage for them in rainy weather to bring them to the hotel for their meals. Raising of the Wachusett House. So this is the Wachusett House that we saw earlier and a picture of it being raised. During the winter of 1869 and 70, the Wachusett House was raised and a new story put under it with an additional L added off to the side, making the hotel of 60 rooms. Harry's family lived in the house during the raising, and his mother did not get out of the house for several months. As a small boy, he enjoyed the whole proceeding, and I have fond memory. I've often wondered how I escaped without breaking my neck, for I was daily climbing over those timbers. Nails were more expensive then than now, and I was promised a pair of white rabbits if I would daily pick up nails that the carpenters had dropped. One day in March, when the raising was nearly completed, a high wind had everybody scared, and all the men were kept busy all day long until dark, putting up braces and shoring the hotel. But the only loss was a chimney in the annex. Something to keep in mind when you visit modern hotels today is we expect to find a bath and running water in every room. And I sometimes wonder how many of our guests put up with this rather primitive arrangement, as water was scarce and bowls and pitchers of waters were placed in every room, which was the only chance for them to bathe. We must remember, however, that plenty of the people were no better off in their homes in the late 1800s. I can remember seeing sponges hanging from almost every window sill in the Wachusett House, and the bellboys being sent to chase them down when they blew away. The Wachusett House had only one bathtub for the entire 60 rooms. Brook Station. These are images of Brook Station. Notice that in the top picture, there's the outline of a barn, and that was an ice house. There was also a water tower at this location to replenish the water needed to power the steam engines. which was fed by a ram pump that in a stream under the railroad tracks. And then this is a picture from Rutland looking toward Princeton, and this is a picture looking from Princeton toward Rutland. Beaman wrote, in 1871, the Boston, Barry, and Gardner Railroad began running through Princeton. It did not start in Boston, and it did not go to Barry, but it did come through Worcester to Princeton and on to Gardner, and thus the stages only had a 2.5-mile trip to make to Princeton Center. That led to a chance for stylish dashes up to the front of hotels, especially by Mr. Doolittle when he held the reins, for he was a lover of good horses and knew how to handle them. Another driver at the time who could handle 4-horse teams like a Wells Fargo professional was Mr. Taylor. With this easier way to reach Princeton, it brought more and more guests for the next 35 plus years to the town as a popular summer resort known not only in Worcester and Boston and Providence, but also as far away as New York, Philadelphia, and even St. Louis. It is established that the summer population increased by 700 people during these peak months of the summer, which was the height of the season. This is an image of the first railroad station at the depot. Beaman writes, the Princeton stations experienced 6 to 9 trains a day traveling each way. The afternoon trains from Worcester, especially on Saturday afternoons, were very busy with businessmen arriving to spend the rest of the weekend with their families. Many coaches, barges, and baggage wagons were lined up at the platforms, as well as private carriages and buggies whose owners often had lively rushes home to see which could reach their destination first with their fast-stepping trotters. Among these were the horses of Mr. Charles Washburn, Mr. Clinton Dreyer with Careless Boy as the lead horse, and Mr. Frank Goddard. These stations also were very busy with fresh produce and manufactured items to and from populated areas. Summit House expansion took place in 1874. A Wachusett company was incorporated, and they built an addition to the original Summit House #1, which is here on the left. And so this is the addition. They also built a barn and a bowling alley, and they made the road a 25-cent charge up to the top, which was paid when they arrived, when people arrived. Here's a second picture of the original Summit House on the left here and the addition on the right. And I assume this canopy was for a picnic area where people could eat outside but be out of the sun. At this point, the expansion is continuing, and I put this slide in so I could stop and get a drink of water. Excuse me. Here is a picture of the Princeton Common in 1875. This is from the Wachusett House front lawn looking north. And if we start and go clockwise from the top left here, this is the Congregational Church is featured with its horse carriages. The house up on the side hill is the parsonage for the Wachusett, for the Congregational Church. The next little building hidden behind the tree is what was called Boylston Hall. And they stored in the base, there was a store in the basement, and they also stored there the instruments for the fife and drum band that they had at that time. This is the Captain Samuel Clark home. And next to it is the Prospect House, and you notice that the columns are now gone. So in converting it over to a hotel, the columns were removed. And then this is the next house is the Joshua Gregory House, and then the Daniel Gregory Home and Store and Post Office. This is a picture of the Mountain House after it was expanded. There's still room for more expansion, which you'll see in another picture. But the small house or the farmhouse style house that was on the right is now gone, and the L that was in between is now enlarged to match the house that's currently there. This was in 1880, and the population of Princeton at that time was 1,100. In 1882, the Harrington Farm, which is out on Westminster Road at 178 Westminster Road, opened up to accept summer boarders. They furnished this house as a restful summer home, especially for families with children. Also in 1882, the Woodland Cottage opened on 11 Prospect Street and was managed by Mrs. Padgham, and it operated from 1882 to 1920. And that same year, Princeton started building their public library and Bag Hall, which were gifts from Mr. Goodnow, Edward Goodnow. The Boylston Annex, which was at 7 Boylston Road, as mentioned earlier, the lower portion of this house was the original Wachusett House in 1822. It was moved in 1849 to make way for that second Wachusett House that I pictured. In 1883, this house on Boylston Ave was expanded by adding porches and a third story with a mansard roof. This seemed to be a trend in the 1880s, was to add mansard roofs to homes. And it would hold 41 guests from Wachusett House. Back in the 1990s, you could still go into this house and see the room numbers on the rooms on the 3rd floor. It is a private residence now. Wachusett Mountain was sold by the Wachusett Company to Phineas A. Beaman and his son Harry, or sons because there was a couple of sons, in 1882. They erected this, tore down what had been there, and erected this 40 by 40 hotel in 1884 and 85, which was sometimes called the Tip Top House. The first manager was G.H. Derby from Fitchburg. This hotel brought, history tells us that this hotel brought nearly 30,000 visitors to the mountaintop a year. The structure had 30 rooms for as little as $10 to $15 a week or $2.50 a day. Each room was supplied with gas and connected to the front desk with electric bells, which was installed by Frank Brooks, which was my grandfather's brother. The Beamans conducted a general hotel business there until the 1900s, when the state took the property bought the property, but essentially took it by eminent domain. The Summit Pond furnished water for washing at the house and at the barn, and was pumped by a windmill to the 2nd floor holding tank in the hotel. Drinking water, though, was brought from a spring about a mile down the road at a location called the Oxbow. The hotel season ran from May 20th to October 15th. Patrons were brought by railroad to either Fitchburg or Princeton stations, and then various stagecoach lines completed their journey to the top of the mountain. Beaman wrote, "We cut our supply of ice from the little pond near the summit. We had to cut the ice early in the winter, or the pond would freeze solid to the bottom. I was helping in near zero weather and carelessly fell in. I still to this day feel the cold when I start talking about it." In 1884, the church, which was on the common, as I showed you in that picture from 1875, was moved over to its current location because Edward Goodnow said he'd build the library and the Bag Hall if the space was made available for them to be at the head of the common, which the town did. In this picture, you notice that you can see the horse sheds to the left of the church, and you can see the barn from the Prospect House down back on the right. In 1885, the dedication was held of the Goodnow Library and Bag Hall. This picture shows in the very prominently in the very middle here, with the top hat and the gray beard, the Honorable C.T. Russell, and right behind him was Edward Goodnow, the donor of the property for the building of the library and Bag Hall. Then Mr. and Mrs. Stearns, Reverend Minor, and Russell's brother Thomas, and Nathan Allen, and Honorable George Hoare were the prominent dignitaries that were in this the front row here. In 1887, the Methodist Church was built at 47 Hubbardston Road, across from the Grimes Tavern, and next to Pratt's Cottage to the west. This area was known as West Village, and specifically was called Methody Corner. The church was struck by lightning and burned in 1899. This home, located at 162 Mountain Road, the center section of the house was built in 1835 by Benjamin Harrington on the site of a home that was built in 1771. A subsequent owner, Wilkes Roper, a builder whose name we've heard before, added the east and the west wings to this house in 1870 and 1872. And he operated a boarding house for Harvard professors and students. In 1885, F.A. Boyd leased the home and used it as a boarding house. During that time, it turned into a tavern and fell in disrepair. In 1890, the Working Girls Club in Boston purchased the house. This club was the first of its kind, and it formed in 1886, or 4 years earlier. The house was updated through donations from wealthy patrons to enable working class women the opportunity for a summer vacation away from the city. The house was refurbished and kept in excellent condition from 1890 to 1989. And it was expertly run and lovingly managed by Josephine Allen. In 1889, Fernside was considered the oldest vacation house in Worcester County. Also in 1889, the house was sold and became a private home and bed and breakfast managed by the Morrisons. It is owned today by McLean Hospital. Population in Princeton at this time was 952, so it is starting to decline. At 254 Mountain Road, where the Mountain Cottage was, in 1893, it was renamed and expanded to sleep 100 guests with hot and cold running water to every room. Notice the lack of trees and the barn in the back. Beaman writes that Mr. Howe, William Howe, who was the nephew of the Bullas, owned and managed this house. The fire epidemic took the Grandview in September of 1899, and there were still a few guests remaining. The only fire that didn't wait till the end of the season. One of the guests lost her wig and had to wear her hair under a hat at breakfast the next morning at the Mountain House. The Mountain House was nice enough to take in the guests that were displaced. As a volunteer fireman, Harry burned his fingers holding a screen door to protect Wayland Davis, who was using a hose to try to put the house, or to try to keep the barn from burning. Both the barn and the tea house were saved. It was the green corn season, and the firemen grabbed pails to carry water from a tank on the engine to pour on the fire, while other firemen took green corn cobs and threw them on the fire. In late 1894, an ad for the Grandview Hotel read, "This house was enlarged and refurbished last season. It has open fireplaces in the parlors and dining rooms, pure spring water, hot and cold, on each floor in a bathroom. The best sanitary arranged house in Princeton. The tables are bountifully supplied. The livery and boarding stable are connected with lawn tennis and croquet grounds. A post office with 2 mails daily and a telephone connected. From its high elevation, the air is pure, and in the evenings on the warmest days, it's usually uniformly cool and delightful. It overlooks a wide extent of varied scenery. There is seldom dew on the grass, and we are free from mosquitoes. A farm is connected with the house, which supplies all the vegetables, milk, and berries. In fact, all the conveniences of a first-class hotel can be found here. On this property today is built a house that the Matthew Rice families owned for many years, and it's still a private home. The resort town begins to wane. Not because a school was built, but this is when the school was built. In 1909, at 18 Boylston Ave, Princeton began the consolidation of their 9 one-room schoolhouses into one grade, 1 through 12 building. When it opened its center school. Each classroom held 3 grade levels. Eventually, the school was enlarged into spread grades over each room to hold 2 grades instead of 3, and an additional gymnasium was added. A small addition was provided much later that provided a science lab and a kitchen. Summit House number 3. In 1907, the second Summit House Hotel was closed right after Labor Day and then torn down. This one was built in its place, which opened in the spring of 1908 under the guidance of the Worcester County Commission and managed by George F. Osgood. The building materials from the old building were reused where possible. In 1908, the next year, automobiles were legally admitted from noon till 2 p.m. and from 5 to 7 p.m. But by 1912, over 5,000 autos were driving to the summit each year. In 1910, because of its popularity, the Worcester County Commission deemed it advisable to build an annex comprising a billiard room, laundry, and several sleeping rooms. You can see that to the right behind the cars, the roof of it anyway. Many lookouts were also added and pavilions on the trails leading to the mountain and the roads leading up. By the middle of 1930s, Overnight stays had dropped considerably, and the building was mostly used as a restaurant, and the rooms were turned into observation lookouts, where you, on a very clear day, you could see over 300 villages and cities in New England and portions of all 5 states. The Wachusett House burns. Wachusett House went up in smoke on November 28th in 1910, or rather, it went down from a fire which began in its roof. This is a view not of the entrance, but from the Worcester Road side of the back of that of the hotel as it was burning. This image is of the railroad station at 283 Hubbardston Road in 1910. This is the depot. When train ridership was at its peak, with 6 to 9 trains arriving and leaving each day with passengers and produce from local farms, milk, blueberries, fruit, manufactured goods, and blocks of ice. Princeton used many of its ponds to cut ice and store it and then ship it to Worcester and beyond to keep refrigerators or icebox cold. The last passenger train was in 1953, and the second track was soon removed. The Mount Pleasant House, which we mentioned earlier, that was on Goodnow Road, in 1912, the Whitney brothers of Worcester bought that property and divided it into 2 attractive homes. Mr. Edward and Harry Beaman lived in those homes for many years. The house was divided right about there, and half of it was moved down the road, I would say probably the length of a football field, maybe as far as 2 football fields. This was one of the only hotels in Princeton that never burned, and the insurance companies were happy for that. Beaman wrote, for many years there was also a summer post office and telegraph located at the Mountain House Hotel. And this is a picture later after its expansion. It had various owners after the Bullard family, Mr. Derby from Fitchburg from 1894 to 1903, George Doherty from Somerville until 1914, but unfortunately, it made another big bonfire in July 1914 and burned to the ground. And that the foundation for this is right next to the Mountain House Trail. The Mountain House, as I said earlier, the Mountain House barn was saved, and bowling alley were saved from the fire, and the barn was eventually torn down, and the bowling alley became a very popular team room managed by Miss Mason, and it's now a private home. In 1950, the population is down to 904. The Princeton Inn, at its peak size in 1895, it was expanded and could accommodate 100 guests. An 1890 advertisement reads, "It has broad piazzas on 3 sides from which is seen one of the finest views in New England. The house is very clean and homelike, beds are good, and the excellence of its table is well known to numerous guests for the past 11 years." Mr. Beaman wrote, after Mr. Thompson owned it, Mr. George Bliss managed the house for 10 years, then Wayland Davis for 18. After the burning of Wachusett House, Harry Beaman took over managing this inn for 7 years, with many of his old guests following him to the what it was now called the Princeton Inn. He then sold it to Mr. Knotts. At the end of the 1923 season, the inn met the same customary fate of the other Princeton hotels with a spectacular fire, which endangered the two Gregory homes that were to the south, but left them more elbow room when the fire was out. In the rear of this hotel was a very large barn, stable, dance floor, and bowling alley. Beaman wrote, and I have updated, before I read this, one more slide. The automobile had a traumatic effect on Princeton. In 1940, the population was down to 713, and then it started to gradually climb. In 1970, the Summit House number 3 burned on December 18th. And in 1980, the population was 2430, and in 2020, it's 3495. As I started to say, Beaman wrote, and I have updated, while Princeton is still a well-liked hometown, as is evidenced by the large number of summer cottages converted into full-time homes, some may wonder why the hotels were not rebuilt to attract people back. The one-word answer is the automobile. With the advent of more people purchasing this mode of transportation, it provided easier access for them to summer camps for boys and girls, tea houses, northern caverns, camps, beaches. Being not sure of the cost of insurance at that time, I wonder whether the owners had insurance for the hotels that burned. It might have not covered the cost to rebuild. Princeton has changed much since it was at the height as a summer hotel resort, but some of us still think of it as one of the most attractive towns in the good old state of Massachusetts. If all is going well, I will post a link to this talk on the Princeton Historical Society page, and an additional link to some additional writings that he had describing Princeton at that time. I will also send out a survey to help us improve future presentations, as well as to guide us as to the topics you might be interested in hearing. Our next presentation will be in May and June, and it will feature a talk about the Boylston family and their unique properties history. Thank you for attending.
Okay.
So you saw most of it.
What?
So you saw most of it.
Yeah.
That
Any
was
questions?
great, Bud. Thank you.
Any questions? None? All right, until we talk again. Yes, Martha.
I don't have a question, but I was very interested in what you were saying. I dealt with you and with Nancy 5, 6, 10 years ago when I visited Princeton, because I have letters that my great-great-grandmother had written in 1885, and she was not in any of the hotels, but she had come up from New Bedford, Massachusetts, and stayed in a farmhouse without running water and all the rest of it. So she didn't have any of these advantages that you were talking about as they slowly made the hotels, but it was interesting to hear about them and what they had, and she certainly didn't have that. She was very ill. She was dying of tuberculosis, which is why she was sent into the countryside.
Yeah. So
But since then, I've followed.
do you know which farmhouse she stayed at?
I didn't go back and review it. Yes, Nancy helped me identify it. We actually went and visited and spoke with the man, and he gave us sort of a tour of it. Maybe she remembers. I mean, I can dig it back out, I think, of the notes that I had taken and all the rest of it. And I've always wondered, the man at that time was refurbishing it and redesigning it and updating it. We're trying to keep it somewhat historic. And I always wondered how his restoration / modernization had turned out. I really don't know.
Nancy, are you still on there?
She's silenced. It looks like she's there, but she's muted.
Yeah, okay. There were a number of other houses in town. There were 2 on Myrick Road that I know of that took in guests. And so it could very well have been one of those homes.
Yeah, I'll try to text, email you and let you know what it was.
Okay, that'd be great. That'd be great. Any other questions? All right, I will sign off then. Thank you for all attending.
Thank you.
Thank you. That's so interesting. Thanks.
Thanks, Bud.
It's quite a long.
Bud, I noticed in the one photo of Fernside that there was a large seesaw on the right side.
Yes, no,
I'm wondering if that's the one that's in the Whitney's barn.
oh, I don't know.
I'd like to go back and take a look at the support for that and see if it matches up to the one in the photo.
Yeah, that would be fun. Thanks, Harry.
Okay, you're gonna turn the hosting back to me and I'll
I'm
shut it
gonna,
down.